in the heart of Ottawa. We're delighted to host you here today as part of International Development Week, and thank you everyone for coming. Before I introduce myself, I'd like to acknowledge that our offices are located on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We recognize their long-standing relationship with this land and express our gratitude and respect for the past, the present, and their future contributions. Additionally, as we all know, this week is a celebration of the incredible work of Canadians working in the sector of international development. Canadians and organizations, I should say. So happy International Development Week to everybody here today. My name is Adrienne Jack, and I'm the head of programs for Southeast Asia for Cowater International. And I'm honored to welcome you here to this special event, which is an event that's been organized by the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals. Cowater has been a member of CAIDP, I think pretty much almost from the beginning, if I'm not mistaken, since the early days, we'll say, and we're very proud to be a part of the board of CAIDP and able to support the really great work it does. CAIDP gives a voice to the concerns and interests of Canadian international development professionals. And on that note, if you're not a member and you're here today and interested, we'd love to have you join. And there are QR codes on those posters around the room. Feel free to scan them for more information in terms of how to become an individual or an organizational member to CAIDP. On another related note, I guess, it's amazing to see so many people gathered here tonight, and and we're all here to hear from a leader in the sector very shortly, who will be introduced shortly. I'm also, on a personal note, very interested to hear and learn more about the new CAIDP Youth Mentorship Program, which is an initiative that aims to inspire and support the next generation of leaders in international development. On that note, there are also papers. You'll learn more, we'll hear more about it tonight, but there are papers on the tables with another QR code. And if you are interested in becoming a mentee or a mentor, you can scan those for more information in terms of the process and how to become engaged in the program. And it's also so great to see so many young professionals in the sector here. And I think that's about it. I did forget one housekeeping thing. I was asked to, if anyone needs a bathroom, our bathrooms are located here, just on the side. And that's about it. So I'll hand it over, but I just want to welcome everyone again for coming here today. It's really a testament of all the great work we're doing, and it's important we take the time to celebrate everything we're doing in the sector and in the world. So now I'm going to hand the floor over to Tim Hodges, who's a professor of practice at the Strategic Global Affairs Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University, which is in Montreal, right?
That's right.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. And Tim was actually going to introduce our speaker tonight, so over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Adrienne. I have to confess that I'm on painkillers. Prescribed painkillers. So do stop me if I raise some ludicrous ideas like adding an 11th province to Canada or something. That's as political as I get. So again, my name is Timothy Hodges at McGill, and I'm also Executive Vice President at CAIDP, and I have been for some time. Again, thank you, Adrienne. Happy International Development Week. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to thank Cowater International for hosting us, so generously hosting us. I'd really like to have a glass of wine, but maybe I shouldn't come. Maybe after.
Do it after this.
But you've been, that's ideally, you've been a very stalwart corporate member of the association and very actively involved through some of your team members in the weekly meetings of our association, very active, very positive. So thank you, not just for this reception, but for your continued support of our profession. I have the floor, and I'm not about to relinquish it. I should say a little bit about CAIDP. You've already said really what I wanted to say, but remind you that it's a volunteer, not-for-profit organization. It's an opportunity to meet, to learn from colleagues. Of course, we're a very diverse community, but certainly we're there to help form a sense of community and actually actively help one another. We were at lunch today with Rohinton and Vicky from Cowater, and I just noted that we're a very diverse group. We're neither fish nor fowl, but interestingly for me, that's kind of its strength, and it's of interest to me because it brings together largely people that are in the field or actively supporting people in the field. So very pragmatic, but also quite interested in the people that they're supporting. So we have a strong sense of community and purpose, which goes beyond the particular things that we do as professionals. But it's a terrific association, and it's one that's in transition, I think it's fair to say. Maybe telling it out of school tale, but I think we're at a stage where, like many organizations, we need to change, we welcome to change, and part of it is largely, or maybe much of it is around the changing demographics and composition of our association. And that's really the purpose of the reception tonight, is to announce our first step in changing, and that is our youth mentorship program. This is it. This is our first formal rollout of the program. It's on the website. We've already got some mentors, and we have some mentees. I'll tell you a little bit about the program, which I am personally very, very excited about. It's open to anyone, everyone, under the age, of 30. So that discounts me, that's for sure, and a few others, but many of you not at all. It's a simple matching approach. We have mentors, and we're encouraging people here who are interested in mentoring to certainly sign up as well, and mentees of a certain age. And the purpose of it is, it's twofold actually. It's sort of mutually beneficial. There's a purpose to our plan, and that is to bring in younger members to the organization, to change the way we think, to adjust the way we do things. But in return for that, perhaps more experienced and largely older cohort, we have something to offer as well. So we think it's a big win-win situation. I should also mention that for those interested in being mentee, being mentored, that we have a special student youth discounted rate of membership. It does require membership to be part of the program. I haven't done the math on it, but Montreal prices, maybe it's about cost of 5 lattes, maybe 6, so, or maybe even less in terms of beer or wine. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I do urge you to use your phones and scan the QR code and help us get this thing started. I have to admit that I haven't signed up to be a mentor yet, but I certainly, sorry Vicky, but I intend on doing it, and I was thinking about it today that I actually should do it, and I will do it, I promise. And I've already paid my membership.
Painkillers are really.
I paid my membership fee, so I want to get my money's worth out of the association as well. But quite seriously, I'm really envious. I wish I had that when I started my career back a few decades ago. I think it would have been a great opportunity. In fact, I do a lot of mentoring at McGill and elsewhere, and I wish I actually had that at Global Affairs through the years that I was there. I think it's such a mutually satisfying, helpful thing to do, be a mentor and be a mentee. Right, So let's move to the key part of our event tonight, and that's our guest speaker. And it's my pleasure, personal, professional pleasure, to introduce Rohinton Medhora. Now, Dr. Medhora is a professor of practice at the International Institute for the Study of Sustainable Development, and he's a colleague of mine. Before that, we had met previously when he was the head of, the former president, of course he is, of CIGI, so that's the Center for International Governance Innovation at Waterloo, where he remains as a distinguished fellow. I mean, I was struck, and I had several visits to Waterloo to meet with you and your staff, Rohinton, a few years back before I left Global Affairs, and I was struck by the energy at the organization, your active participation in our discussions, which were frankly at a lower level, wasn't the level of president, but you were very closely involved, you were very supportive, and you were very much on the ball. And you always had something interesting to say, which I thought was really resulted from your thinking, your deep thinking. So I appreciated that very much. And so that's why I know we're very fortunate to have you here today, because you have been thinking, you're always thinking, and it's based on not just intellect and study and research, but also on your deep, wide experience in the field. So I feel personally very privileged that you're here. I should say a bit more about you, because it's sort of shortchanging you, because our lives could have intersected as well at IDRC. Unfortunately, I was there probably about a decade before you arrived, and I didn't have benefited from being under your leadership there. But that organization I know quite well, not as well as you do, but I was always impressed and remain impressed with the center, with its legacy, even during difficult times. And your leadership certainly continues in many, many ways influencing our thinking and that of the center. We do have something else in common with the IDRC, and that is my sister was the head of the library at IDRC, and she described you quite recently to me as one of her best patrons. So there you go. She has, you have her endorsement, and that's a big deal from my perspective. We have a lot of text about you because there's so much to say about you and your accomplishments. Are currently active in a number of boards, I know. Really interesting work on digital transformations for Health Lab. You just shared a paper with your colleagues at McGill, which I finally read after we had lunch. Sorry I hadn't read it earlier. And I hadn't realized it was talking about, with solid research and with your colleagues who co-authored the paper, about things that have been sort of emerging in my mind but I could never articulate. So congratulations on that. It doesn't sound very interesting. I'll give you the title so you can Google it. But I can assure you it's really, really fascinating and really relevant to people, to practitioners, and not just academic. So it's called, titled Intangible Assets and Their Implications on Policy in Developing Economies. I know it's not riveting, but it's very important work. So thank you for that, and my apologies for not reading it earlier. So, without further ado, I'd ask you to please come up to the podium and share with us some of your current thinking, and welcome again.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and I didn't know what a lousy afternoon Tim had had until he told me he'd spent it reading my paper. I apologize. When I joined IDRC in 1992, I mean, this happens in any organization, but you join and there's always the old timers who kind of look at you with suspicion, and you know, things were great kind of until you got there, was the subtext. And now I understand why. You know, you were there before me and had done great things, and then along comes some of us to break glasses and bottles and different kinds of crockery and cutlery. I guess I should say, contrary to building, that I'm going to really try to not give a talk. What I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, is make a few points and then generate a discussion among us. So please feel free to come in afterwards, and if you need lubrication for it, it's all here. And you know, there's events, dear boy, events around us. So I don't think it makes sense to be driven by what we've seen happen in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but in my view, it's part of a larger trend, and it's that trend that we should be thinking about, and like to talk about that. But, you know, so I've got sort of 3 blocks of thoughts, but I always begin this kind of, and especially on the very important mentorship program and things like that, which I've always valued, is to remind young people, including our folks at ICIT who join, is, you know, you're going into development, of course, to do good and make the world even better. And I don't for a minute want to suggest to you that things are fine in the world. But I also want to remind my friends that actually you're entering a field that is ravishingly successful. If we see problems around us, I'm willing to make the case that they're the problems that come with success, not failure. That is not to belittle those issues, but, you know, bear me out on that. One way to look at that is to say that when the UK embarked on its industrial revolution, it took 150 years for incomes to double. And when the US embarked on its industrial revolution, and the countries just before continental Europe, took them about 50 years to double their incomes. And you know, China and India, and not just the Asian tigers, but broadly speaking, the current generation of countries have kind of embarked on industrialization. The rug might be pulled under them from technology, we'll come to that, but in about 20 years. Okay? They're also everywhere, except in, you know, pockets of war-torn regions, living longer, frankly eating better. I give a lot of credit to CGIAR and public initiatives like that. Another success story we should be proud of. They're dying of fewer and fewer really horrible diseases, and on and on and on. I could go on about that. But when you think of the problems that people complain about, you know, the poor quality of universities in many countries, the environment, the congestion, the traffic, one way to look at that is that that's all because there's growth around you. We may have completely missed the point by only focusing on economic growth, and that's certainly something that I think we should reflect on, is that whether we're measuring the right things. And if there's one thing we learned in development, it is that there is no single indicator, and that, as Amartya Sen would say, you know, ultimately development is about the self and about capabilities and the trajectory. It's the journey and all of that. And so that's the spirit in which I come at this. It's not about solving problems in countries that have it bad. That's not how I see development. It's very much about a more global sort of feature. You can't avoid what's going on in Washington. And I'm not at all a political observer. If someone asks me what troubles me about especially the fiasco at AID, I'd say that, you know, what's troubling is certainly, obviously, the crudeness and the speed with which it's happening. But if the point is to say aid programs, especially in large countries, should be more aligned with their geostrategic interests, and this is a takeover of aid by the State Department, you know, we've kind of been through that here. In terms of the tactics, that worries me the most. I think the Trump minimes are watching all this stuff and thinking, gosh, if I'm only half as bad, people won't see me as outlandish. And so worse and worse behavior is becoming normalized. And so countries on the brink of change themselves should be watching like hawks on the demonstration effect that this has in other countries. That really worries me. But what actually happens at AID and so on is important, but that's not the real story. I think the story is the shared values, good and bad, that this seems to demonstrate, and the reaction it might engender, and whether this is a genuinely global reaction. The other thing, of course, that I find weird is that at a time when soft power is so important, and actually even China, which actually is really bad at soft power. I mean, India had sort of Bollywood and Gandhi and it's, you know, it's democracy. There's a sort of soft power there which projects, which China didn't have. And now you've got sort of the US giving up on one of its important soft power tentacles and ceding all of that territory to the Chinas and Russias. And so that's why I'm optimistic, that I can't believe that the US really thinks that it can project itself and compete with China and then give up on this stream where, you know, 3/4 of the people live. So again, horrible situation, but let's make sure those kinds of things don't happen in other countries, and let's also make, you know, celebrate the civil society and create the civil society reactions and common sense reactions that must happen. And that's been the story of development, in my view, everywhere. We can certainly talk about that, and I'm sure many of you have sort of different takes, and many of you are closer to what's going on at AID, but there's all of that. So then the question becomes, you know, I forget what the talk was billed as, but, you know, what's changed in development since I and Tim and so many of you, all of us, in fact, many of us joined. And of course, one could make a long list and so on, but what I found with, when I first began working on this in the mid-1980s, actually, at the IMF, was that we're much more conscious about spillover effects. Whether it's good things, or whether it's bad things. The bad things catch our attention, and I get that. COVID, if we have time, we can get into the pandemic and the vaccine thing, certainly the financial crisis in 2007 and 8, which generated the kinds of reactions that have led to the rise of populism everywhere. But spillover effects matter a lot more. And so one thing, when someone says, where might development be going, I'm quite sympathetic to the view that we should devote more time creating the global public goods rather than sort of working in silos in individual countries or situations. So yes, there has to be a way to make a hospital functional in the middle of a pandemic area, but who's thinking about revisiting TRIPS or the global intellectual property regime or the way in which we're doing innovation? Yes, we should be thinking about debt relief, but never mind debt relief. Who's thinking about the financial system in a way that it doesn't create those problems in the first? And I think the development community has been absent in those kinds of high-level global discussions on architecture and on the contextual things that developing countries value so much. And the good news there is that many developing countries have found their voice, have seats at the table, and so on. And if Canada seems to be, and is, in my view, less present and less effective, it's because, not necessarily because something Canada has done wrong, although I'm sure we have, but because the Chinas and Indias and South Africas have risen on the global table. And so Canada's been bypassed by this other group. And so, you know, our whole thing about being a bridge between North and South and speaking for the South, you know, my successor at IDRC is here, Santiago. One person once said, you know, I see IDRC as the embassy of the South in Ottawa. I don't think anyone says that anymore because they don't have to. They don't need an IDRC to speak for them. So, you know, there's all of that in which I think Canada would be much better placed thinking about global public goods, but B, also shared values and so on. I think tech, you alluded to it, Tim. I think the tech and IP thing that's going on is hugely important. And again, let's not be discouraged by the monopolization of technology and power in basically two centers, China and the US, both of which disempower the common man and woman. But I'm really optimistic by the Indian stack, which I talk up every opportunity I get. Digital ID, M-payments, financial inclusion, increasingly health, and soon the judiciary. Something like 30% of disputes in India are land related, on which actually just, you know, crunching the database and using AI kind of gets rid of a lot of that kind of stuff, and so no corruption. And there's a series of things, and that model is now being exported. Where's Canada in that? I don't know. I mean, yeah, I spent 10 years reorienting CG to these questions and came to the conclusion that actually Canada has developing country characteristics when it comes to the modern economy. But I do think that there's something here in tech and IP that we might want to get on board sooner rather than later. We've talked about the rise of India and China, but I would remind us that if we have populism in our midst, one very simplistic sort of storyline would be that, aided and abetted by liberalization and information and communications technologies, we liberalized financial flows. We didn't liberalize trade or global governance as much. You couldn't keep up with it. And so you found this sort of hollowing out of jobs. And so many developing countries thrived because of that, created, you know, the kind of the Fenton Midwest kind of sectors, certainly in the UK, in the US, increasingly in continental Europe, and I suspect in parts of Canada. And so the backlash to China and India and deindustrialization is actually, again, because of the success of the development model. This is how it was supposed to work. And if we don't pay attention to domestic social safety nets and domestic human capital formation and so on, we should not be surprised to see the things we are. But let's not blame developing countries for it. I think there's a lot of room for domestic policy to be smarter. And so this is absolutely the wrong thing to say this week, I get that. But I'm strongly wedded to that story of a sort of global transformation. And so we have to be paying more attention to domestic inequality, which isn't just income and wealth inequality, but has to do with different identities and what we called in the book we once did some years ago, horizontal inequalities rather than vertical ones. And that sort of just leads me to two final thoughts. One is that alliances matter. And whether it's young people here or whether it's professionals or central bankers or any other groups, they have more in common often across countries than they do with their fellow citizens. And those global networks will be thriving even further. And if there's hope in some of the bad things we're seeing around us, I'd like to think it's these global networks that will be mobilized. They won't just mobilize on their own. And again, I think we should be thinking about which ones we want to belong in and nurture and which ones not. But that's one. The other thought, if you know, and I hate to be the old fogey in the room, but when I joined and decided to go into development, so to speak, the options were limited. And today what you find is that you can sort of do development and work in a development setting by working in almost any company, in almost any sector there is. Development isn't just for the development folks. And that's important, because if you maintain that development sensibility wherever you are, then it doesn't matter if you're at Procter & Gamble or if you're at Goldman Sachs. Don't forget your values. And you know, this has happened last week where, you know, as part of the tech sort of move into Trump, there was a couple of companies that's, you know, were sort of supporting transgender people by having sort of feminine hygiene products in men's washrooms, and then they kind of took them away because this was now no longer fashionable and was seen as woke and DEI. What did the employees in Silicon Valley do? They just brought those products themselves and left them in the washrooms. You know, never mind what management does. They kind of came back with that kind of, and I think there's more and more of that. I'm not, you know, I sound like an old-fashioned Marxist. Of course I'm not. But there are way more workers than there are managers. And I think if you think of the strength and the intellect and the values that the workers have, there's a lot we can still do. And I'll end on this note. So this is all good, but how does it come together? I don't know. I mean, that's, I hope, something we can discuss. But if there's one thing that really worries me, and I've said this to my friends up the street, is I don't know if we have a narrative anymore. A narrative that everyone buys into, by which I mean this. So if you go to the sort of the start of the modern era of development cooperation, and if you think of, say, the Marshall Plan or the European project, the narrative was building peace and prosperity through economic integration. And most people, having been through that kind of war, at least in Europe, kind of, it made sense to most people that you don't, you know, thumb your vanquished into the ground, you actually build them up in your image and so on. And then when you think of the Colombo Plan and so on, again, at the time, keeping communism at bay and not having the dominoes fall in Asia and recognizing the importance of rural sectors and of agriculture and so on. There was a narrative there that led people to think, yes, we should be doing this. Fast forward to, you know, the Green Revolution, the creation of the CGIAR. We'd seen those horrible pictures from Biafra in India and so on. And there was a sense that using technology to improve nutrition and making agriculture more modern, people kind of saw that. We've then been through, you know, democracy building institutions. There's a series of these, but today I honestly don't know if there's a narrative that we as a community have created that others can, I mean, we can talk to each other about SDGs and the 268 indicators to measure them and so on. It means nothing to someone 2 kilometers away from here. But that broad narrative is no longer there. I think we have to find it again. It can be sought out. There are many competing narratives we might want to think about. But I do think that sometimes we're so busy working on our stuff that we've forgotten what the development enterprise was about. And it wasn't just about helping poor people. It was actually about keeping the world together, keeping it whole, and keeping it not just nourished physically, but in terms of spirituality and values and intellect and all of these other things. And there's something there that has broken, as we see clearly around us. But if we're going to come together, and if Canada had to play a role in making this all happen, I'd begin with a really good construct around why is it that we are one world and not several. So that's as far as I can go for now. I know I've spoken well beyond, but that was all just to sort of, not to bore the Jesus out of you, but to provoke you to say a few things, and maybe Vicky and Adrian, however you want this to move. But I'm happy to stop here and hear us and keep chatting.
I guess open for questions. You know, great remarks, and thank you.
And I'm not going to stand at the podium.
I'm going to sit too. So please, Tim, we're going to get us started.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for all of that. There's lots to chew on, as always. One thing we were talking at lunchtime, or maybe sort of reflecting on our conversation at lunch, the north-south divide, which seems to me, the way we characterize it was global north, south, as we all know. At some levels that continues to work. Many other levels it doesn't. The world's more diverse and more complicated. It's not just two poles, etc. But I wonder what your thoughts are. I mean, and I see it play out. I work, do a lot of UN treaty support, particularly in the biodiversity field and climate change. Diplomatically, the game remains visually the same, north versus south, right? And region versus region. But when it comes to international development, it doesn't seem to me to really fit anymore. It wasn't very helpful to begin with. And so you have the rise, Brazil, the BRICS, and others is certainly projecting more power. But what does that actually mean? And you mentioned Canada sort of as a middle power, soft power player. But what does that actually mean for development and understanding international development? Maybe this goes to your narrative idea, which I think is a really good one, and not an easy one to answer. But do you see that whole north-south thing? I mean, it goes on in New York, the UN, you know, but is it really, is it possible to actually get rid of it and still think about, and still have international development happen, because it has been the dynamic that works north, south, the south. But do you think it would be a good thing to kind of, if it just sort of left us? Do you think that's going to happen?
Do you want to take other reactions?
I think you can start with Jim. It's a pretty big question.
You know, since we talk about mentors and so on, I learned a lot from so many people, but the one person I'd name at this point is my friend and former professor Jerry Heliner at and colleague at U of T. He always used to talk about how, you know, someone would say, you know, well, why do we have, why are we giving money away to one of these countries when there's poverty right at home, and look at our reserves, and you know, and he would just smile and say, you know what, the people who say that don't have much sympathy for poverty programs at home or in the inner city or on the reserves either. So I mean, let's not kid ourselves about this belly aching about poverty at home. Second, I mean, who's saying this? Like, do you hear indigenous leaders say foreign aid's too high? I mean, do you hear food bank leaders say foreign aid's too high? You know, so there's a solidarity that's actually across countries. And I think, to your north-south point, that so long as we saw no problems at home and problems to solve somewhere else, we would keep getting trapped in this narrative that hasn't gone away. I also think, and again, you know, I'm not pronouncing on current events or policy, but one reason I think that many European countries and Canada have kind of weirdly rocky relations with Brazil and South Africa and India and China is because we haven't gotten our heads around the fact that these are not recipients, these are not people, you know, we're going to talk to about indicators and impact and so on. And so the North-South, what did, when India and China became emerging and so on, you know, they didn't say, oh good, we'll give UNCTAD more money. You know, they want a bigger voting share at the IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah.
So I really think we have to see global governance and the relatives of weight of countries differently than we've been doing. And of course, around the corner, there was our one and only and now gone think tank, the North-South Institute. Even its name was wrong, even when it was created. And, you know, we knew that. But I think that's just the wrong way. I think if I'm worried about developments in Mali or whatever, I should be worried about developments in northern Saskatchewan as well. And see that, because increasingly, as I said, developing countries have done well at the expense of having created pockets of marginalization here. And that's the narrative we should be more conscious about.
Any questions? No.
Building on the conversation that started about global south and global north, I remember when I started working in this field, Canadians in general seem to open the conversation on these projects by saying that we're here to share the good and the bad that we have. It was a nice opening line, but it was still a quote-unquote developed country talking to a developing country, right? It did open doors, but at the end of the day, it was still a project where we were sharing that was supposedly good and working well, that could be used by somebody that needs it. But as the world is changing, and perhaps in part as a result of what we're doing, in many of the fields where we work, I think we see that quote-unquote developing countries innovating and advancing in many areas faster than us. So the question is really to stay relevant. Is development, does it need to be more of a dialogue at this point? And we have to willingly acknowledge the fact that in the opportunity to learn from what is happening in other parts of the world. I work in the field of democratic governance. We continue to be seen as a democratic country, and many of them want to talk to us and learn from us. But we also have a fair bit of inertia in our system of governance, for good and for bad. Speaking of artificial intelligence and so on, some countries in the world are experimenting much faster than us in using that in their governance system, sometimes for good reasons. I mean, it's still an unknown field in terms of what it does, but I'm sure it happens in a number of other quote-unquote development fields. So it's really how ready we are to acknowledge and that this needs to be more of a real dialogue, and are we geared towards making it?
Yeah. Totally agree. I mean, again,
If there are other questions, you can ask them now, and then Rohinton can follow up.
I have one, if I may, on the narrative, and I agree that many audiences require different narratives. But I'm thinking these days more and more on how we lost part of our credibility by not being able to understand, to create a narrative that was connecting to the ones that will be left behind in the global north, and therefore easier to be convinced that the international development or the changes and transformations that we want to see that was very clear. And we have been so convinced of what was needed because we understood the complexity of the system, because we were the experts, that in that piece we have lost a big part of the community. Because the message was very simple back in the days. You get peace because you get development, economic development, you get democracy because you have access to markets, you get food because you plant seeds. And then we began to understand the complexity of the system that are needed in order to implement our programs, our research, our investments. But we didn't spend time on translating that, and therefore losing many that now are open to believe the bunch of lies that are being dropped on them. I mean, in the case of the DI, climate change, name it. I mean, things that are basic facts for us, but we haven't been able to really translate that. And I'm thinking right now back when I took on probably one of your jobs, I think probably 7 years, on ADRC, we have the agriculture environment. It's very easy to understand for everybody to do agriculture environment. That's very easy, anyone understand that piece. But we understood that there was more complex we are doing, and then we developed a climate resilient system. From a scientific and technical point of view, makes more sense. But I have lost half of the population that will not understand why ADRC is not working on agriculture environment rather than in climate resilient food systems, but it's like very complex. So how much is also part of our own responsibility to educate and to engage in communications and conversations with the global policy, with the policymakers, to know that we have provided with enough ammunition to actually criticize the complexity of the work we do. Or that was a lost battle anyway, because it will be criticized the gaps that we do.
one thing when I'm one of those, I'm a big, even though it hasn't lived up to its promise at all, I'm a big fan of the G20. I think it's the one and only hope we have to create a global governance system that's efficient in decision making, which we know the UN system isn't, but is representative of a lot of diversity and all that other stuff, poverty and so on. And when Paul Martin, both as finance minister and then prime minister, was with Larry Summers, thinking this all through, and he was talking to many people around town, including a much younger version of myself. And you know, one of his things always was, I don't think I'd understand something if I didn't have the leader and I could look him in the eye. That was his expression. I need to look Manmohan Singh in the eye before I understand something. And the old setup didn't let you do that. You know, when you had G7 and then when you have, you know, circuses like UNGA, well, no one really talks to anyone because everyone's talking to everyone, kind of thing. And so the G20 was that in which there was going to be exactly what I think both of you allude to, that knowledge and information and wisdom should be a two-way thing. And the fact that it hasn't become that is one of those things I don't know, but I still think we're better off with this imperfect G20 than not having one at all. It has some unsung successes which are better to have than to not have, including having averted a really bad trade war in 07, 08, or creating some principles for new technology. But generally speaking, the reason, what's going to make us acknowledge our own fault lines, which I think was your point, is going to be interaction among leaders at levels at which they can actually learn and understand from each other. And once you do that, then it's no longer about my development program helping your country. It's going to be about a much more a porous ecology of ideas. And then you promote good ideas, and it doesn't have to be through foreign aid. It could be through various different channels, including the strength of public opinion, where good and bad ideas can now take off. But I think that's the way of the future.
Other questions? Come on, I know we're such a small group. It's like we're having a little, little side chat. Christopher.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments actually, and I agree with you in terms of changing the narrative and being more about what we can take back. And I've been thinking about this for a while because when talking about our work back here in Canada, which I'm responsible for in some ways, about telling that narrative about what Canadians do abroad, back home, to convince Canadians that what we do in the world as global citizens and as experts in certain areas to, actually does something that's good and can be of interest to us and it's worth investing in. But I think it's hard sometimes to put an emphasis on, okay, what are we bringing back home? And often I ask that of people that we work with, and it's not always clear, but I think there's something there that could help change the narrative, and I see it all over the place. Like many countries like Rwanda, they're way ahead of us in terms of e-health and other areas, and we talked about IT issues. I think there's a whole bunch of other areas as well where we learn so much from going abroad. And I don't think we put enough emphasis on that when we come home and we think about it. I know, I've integrated many of the learning over the years. So I think there's something there, but I was struck by one of the first comments you made, Rohinton, around, the collapse potential, obliteration. I'm getting WhatsApps from lots of friends in the South talking about the impact that is having on them and the people that, USAID has had such an immense influence on so many people, and you forget about it really, and then I'm seeing it now again. But we went through that, you're right, we went through that. And I remember I was in the West Coast at the time, working for a small NGO when CETA, when Harper, you know, annihilated CETA and brought it into DFAID, I think, or anyway, the Department of Foreign Affairs at the time. And, you know, there was a big backlash. And I wasn't so sure. And now I'm working for a project which really is the result of that integration of thinking more coherently around how how aid is a part of one of the other ways that we're engaging with the world. And I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. You know, after it's been over a decade now that we've been living with that. And I remember the reaction that it was. And so seeing this with USAID, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next little while, what the backlash actually comes out in the States. But I'd be curious maybe for the conversations we have, you know, what other people think about that, those of us that have been in the game for a while, right? And what it actually looks like today, you know. I don't, you know, there were some players that are no longer here, but I think for partially other reasons, not for those reasons. So it'll be, yeah, I'm just curious to see what that looks like in the future. I mean, apart from, you know, Trump, who looks like he's going to cut a lot, there's no question, although to cut everything, it's just unfathomable for all those people that are obviously being affected by it right now, and the whole industry that is dependent on that. It seems a little bit far-fetched, but who knows? Who knows with this guy? So, a comment. I'm curious that I don't know if you want to mention sort of your take on the dissolution of CETA and what that has meant for Canada's place in the world and how development plays with it.
I didn't lose friends because I never had any, I suppose. But I was one of those that was not totally critical of the absorption of CETA into then DFAID. For the reasons that it was, you know, who's kidding who? It was already happening. Some of the economies, like sharing a policy shop, actually made a lot of sense. So long as it also meant bringing development sensibilities into your diplomatic and trade policy, and it couldn't just be one way. Let's make those development fellows, you know, learn about trade and not the other way. And so that's a bit of a disappointment, but successive ADMs for policy tell me that no, that's now happening, and you know, the diplomats and the development and the military types get development more because of that and so on. So generally speaking, I don't have a problem with, as I say, seeing your foreign aid budget as being a projection of your national ethos. Also because we have multilateral agencies that are much more independent, who can do all the really independent stuff away from, and then the government can say, it's those UNICEF people, no, it's not Canadian official policy. So I didn't have a problem with all of that. But I would have a problem if the net result was that the dollars flowing to developing countries, or for those kinds of issues, including global public goods, decreased. And something I forgot to say at the outset was, again, I don't for a minute excuse the speed and crudeness with which things are happening in Washington, but ODI had a paper just a week or two ago, you know, showing how just about every, if not every, Western European aid program has either cut its budget or, this is a great one, you know, cheated by redefining ODA to include domestic refugee resettlement and that kind of finagling. The Swiss, and this is, we talk about Canada's, how come we talk about Canada's 2% commitment to NATO and never the 0.7%? I mean, you know, which commitments do we get up, you know, really worked up about, and which ones don't we? And even if you look at job creation, which industry creates more jobs? Defense spending or social programs? So there's just a lot of things we could say if we had effective spokespeople on these things. But the Swiss, in the last week, I'm told, increased their military budget by exactly the dollar amount that they've decreased their development assistance program. So again, when I say, are there mini-me's watching that and trying to do it elsewhere, you know, this is not helpful, but this is, to me, much more important than how your aid program is administered as such. Because I think they're really thoughtful people in Pearson Building and elsewhere. We had Ashraf Ghani, back when he was seen as a respected, when he was finance minister of Afghanistan, came to IDRC for something, and someone asked him, you deal with a lot of development agencies, which one's your favorite? And without trying to be ironic or cute or funny, he said, the Canadian Army. The Canadian Army was. So I completely get that development skills and sensibility and so on do not just reside in a few aid bureaucrats. It can be anywhere and everywhere. Hence my point about join Goldman Sachs, but don't forget what drives you as a personal human being.
I think we had another question over here.
I started off my career in international development, spent 20 years in it, and then I moved to poverty in Canada. And from that perspective, I look at international development as a very structured way of dealing with the world and bureaucracies. And at the same time, in recent years, I've really come to see diaspora communities and the amount of knowledge and resources. I'm thinking particularly in Ottawa, the Somali community, the Congolese community, and the impacts, positive impacts they are having at home through the skills they're building here, the wealth they're transferring from here. And yet I don't see any connection between those. And certainly, you know, anyone in this room who, you know, was born a certain time in Canada, this country has changed remarkably. But yet I think there's an opportunity there to grasp these diaspora communities and learn from them and understand how the work that international development work is tied to these communities. Period.
Create the soft tissue so that those kinds of things happen. I still don't, actually I asked Chris, I didn't get a, but to what extent do our aid bureaucrats talk, not to their counterparts in Italy and so on, that's the traditional stuff, but to their counterparts in the Chinese aid program, or the Indian aid program, and there isn't enough of that happening. There isn't enough of a soft tissue happening among social justice groups or environmental justice groups across countries who can then lobby their own leaders at home. So it's a two-way process. You kind of want that international experience, and then you want to be able to affect change at home. And it's, at least in Canada, I find that's the bit that seems to be, we seem to be tripping up on. Am I?
Yeah, I'm in the 90s involved with the Community Health Center in Ottawa before going overseas. And we invited a bunch of folks from overseas to talk to, I think one of them was the Khmer community, which is very recent to Ottawa, because there was building a large Cambodian desk program, and we thought, well, here's this community living here who experienced the genocide, the war, but it was a very kind of awkward conversation. I mean, you know, that's 25 plus years ago. Maybe it'd be better now, but are we learning? We have these assets here. Can we learn from them? Can we use their links, their connections? I don't know, but it seems to me it's a huge opportunity that we, in a multicultural country as ourselves, to learn from and build our development programs, at least in part using the experience and knowledge of the communities that live here.
Yeah. I mean, the Canadian diversity, and why isn't it asserting itself in ways that some of us would like to see? Yeah, I mean, I could make really bald generalizations, but that would be irresponsible. But I happen to agree with you on the broad point.
We have time for one more.
I just to react on that, on the volunteering cooperation program. We do something like this, or I was at South Quebec, and so we have binationals and people from diaspora going back and volunteering historical Canadians going and doing volunteering, when more and more dual citizens from the diaspora, and bridging that, and to your point also coming back with stories to the communities, and there are ambassadors saying that this is what we learned also from being there, from being in those countries, and bringing, just bridging the gap. People there have their expertise. They are good. They just lack some accesses maybe that we're bringing. And when people from the diaspora go and are integrated easily in those communities, the impact is really great. You don't have to do any integration process. Well, there is an integration process, but it's less and less because of the familiar, they know the culture, and they bring also those stories back home to the communities where they live. And I talk about Quebec because some Canada is in Canada, and some Quebec is dealing with Quebec communities, and so when they hear about the value that Canada brings to the other communities, I think there is, and I see hope in that. I know at Oxfam, as a confederation, we talk a lot about decolonizing our work and localizing our interventions, and maybe we can see the volunteering approach as maybe still colonial, but I can see, and from partners on the ground, that they see value on that, and so we can build on that and balancing between decolonization and still bringing bridging the gaps that we see.
Great. Well, Rohinton, thank you so much for this evening and for bringing us all together. It's a special week for our field of work. We all work so hard, and it's been a tough few weeks for everyone, right? You feel like everyone's kind of feeling a little down with what's going on. I've just come back from Zambia and being in the field with people who are losing their jobs, and it's what's sort of the buzz in our work. So it's really great to be here tonight with you and all of you who've made time out of your busy schedules to come. And so thank you very, very much. And you've given us a lot of food for thought, and we will look forward to, maybe we'll be able to entice you back for better times next year. Anyway, thank you very much. And I would be not a great colleague without thanking all my co-water colleagues for all their work in helping to make this happen. So thank you all very much. And to our Alinea colleagues as well, thank you. You're hiding back here, but thank you. So there you go. These are the CAIDP corporate members really here, Alinea and Co-Water. And so thank you all very much on behalf of the CAIDP board for coming out and being part of the renewal of CAIDP. And I hope you all have yielded Tim's comment about becoming a member. The QR code's there, and we've got your emails, and we're going to email you. And anyway, look forward to seeing you all again at our next event, which we will announce sometime soon. Anyway, enjoy.
Rich, do you want more or?
No,
Okay. You're just dropping it off?
Oh, it's good for food.
Okay.
And I want more wine. Thank you.